Okay, let's unpack this. This deep dive takes us into a single, pretty powerful source document. It's called To the Land That Remembered When No One Else Did.
And what's really striking right off the bat is the perspective. It's written looking back from 2030.
Yeah, looking back at things that sort of solidified around 2025 and trying to grasp their profound long-term impact.
Exactly. It feels very reflective, almost like an elegy for what the writer sees as this critical turning point.
Right. So our mission here, for you, our listener, is to go through this and pull out the core message. It talks about, devastating loss, claims of global inaction, and these ripple effects it sees spreading across justice movements globally. And maybe most hauntingly, this alleged erosion of collective memory and culture. We want to extract the key insights.
It definitely challenges you, puts you in this difficult possible future looking back. It has a very specific, somber argument.
So how does it start? This look back from 2030. It sets a really stark scene.
It does. It talks about standing at an empty threshold, a vacant place where the land itself, it only remembers only the echo of those who never returned.
Wow. That sense of emptiness is really central.
It is, and it immediately brings in powerful imagery, like quoting Mahmoud Darwish saying, "We have on this land all of that which makes life worth living." She was called Palestine.
And the source uses that to create this painful contrast, right?
Exactly. A contrast with the reality it claims exists by 2030, where that land Darwish described as full of life is now laid waste. Villages gone, orchards ruined, that kind of thing.
And it makes this really interesting and quite sad point about memory. It references things from around 2025, like a UNESCO envoy noting how back then, even under intense pressure, Palestinians were really focused on preserving heritage because it was part of our people's memory and history they were actively fighting for.
Right, actively protecting that connection. But the source claims that by 2030, even that memory, that sort of fused connection, is fading.
So the feeling you get from the opening is witnessing what it calls a vanished people.
Yeah, and this chilling idea that their story is something the land itself will no longer tell. It really lays the groundwork for this narrative of profound, almost irreversible loss.
Which brings us to the document's really sharp critique of the international response, or how it frames it, the collapse of the moral compass.
Yeah.
Especially looking at the run-up to 2025.
Yeah, this is where it gets very pointed. It claims that for who it calls the so-called guardians of justice globally, inaction just became, well, the new norm.
And it tries to back this up with specifics, citing human rights groups. It mentions Human Rights Watch, HRW. The source says HRW stated that the deliberate deprivation of water and food could amount to an act of genocide, and that HRWs even use terms like extermination and genocide for those specific actions.
So the source is really emphasizing how strong those warnings apparently were at the time.
Yeah. And it also brings in Professor Noura Erakat, speaking at the 2025 UN Nakba commemoration. He quotes her directly, "If you normalize genocide, you will have nothing left."
Stark warnings. The document presents these as urgent alarms that, from its 2030 perspective, were basically ignored.
And it doesn't just talk generally about inaction. It details what it claims were concrete examples of this failure. Like it says, the United States vetoed 5 separate UN ceasefire resolutions.
Right.
While at the same time approving new multi-billion-dollar arms sales to Israel.
And it also claims European leaders sort of jealously shielded their partnership, even with high numbers of reported civilian deaths.
So the argument here is that international law, conscience, were effectively cast aside.
Yeah, that's the claim. That what should have been seen as an unbearable atrocity just became just another conflict in the headlines. Like the world got desensitized.
And how does the source say this was justified, this alleged turning away?
It argues that the mantra of security was used over and over to justify every outrage, and that governments leaned on vested interests, arms sales, trade deals, diplomatic rivalries.
So geopolitical and economic interests overriding humanitarian concerns.
That's the source's perspective, yes. It concludes this bit by claiming that by 2030, a sorrowful cynicism had settled over world opinion. A belief that leaders had basically traded away the last flicker of moral clarity for these other gains. It's a harsh judgment, looking back.
Okay, so the source lays out this claimed moral and legal collapse. But it argues this had ripple effects, right, beyond the immediate region. impacting global justice movement.
Exactly. It suggests that as a result, the Palestinian cause was quietly erased, and this loss created a kind of void in solidarity struggles elsewhere.
This is where it tries to connect the dots globally.
Right. It highlights several specific examples of how this alleged erasure impacted different movements and weakened those bonds of solidarity it claims existed.
Let's look at those connections. It talked about Latin America, indigenous struggles, saying studies showed how the Palestinian cause echoes loudly in indigenous struggles in Latin America, shared colonial histories, that kind of thing.
And the source claims Palestinian solidarity was this vital sign of hope for them. With that gone, those bridges crumbled. It calls it extinguishing a flame of internationalist hope.
It also brings in South Africa, referencing that famous Nelson Mandela quote, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians."
Yeah, a very well-known quote. And the document's view is that this legacy of brotherhood between the movements was essentially severed by 2030.
And it connects to Black liberation movements, too, in the U.S. and globally. It quotes Angela Davis, noting the Palestinian quest for justice is central to liberation struggles here in the U.S. and in other parts of the world.
So the source sees Palestine disappearing from that conversation as tearing an entire thread in the tapestry of global solidarity. A huge loss.
And finally, indigenous North America. The source seems to feel this connection is really important.
It does. It claims Palestine had become the moral barometer of indigenous North America, mentioning shared grief on days like the Nakba anniversary and Indigenous Peoples Day.
So the point is, losing Palestine meant losing a yardstick of justice. Invoking Palestine was affirming their own struggles.
Right. So the overall argument here is that these diverse movements now carry this void, that Palestine, which it claims illuminated the fight against colonialism, racism, empire for many, while it's just not there in the same way as a rallying point.
It claims global resistance itself is impoverished by this loss. It's making a really powerful case about how interconnected these struggles were and the cost of seeing one just vanish.
And moving into another deeply affecting area, the source gets into the devastating impact it claims occurred on Palestinian cultural memory. It describes this vibrant culture being driven underground or obliterated.
And it gives specifics, right? Data points from UNESCO by 2025.
Yeah, pretty stark numbers. It says 110 cultural heritage sites verified, damaged, or destroyed in Gaza alone. And lists examples: monuments, mosques, ancient libraries, museums, all in ruins.
And it reiterates claims from cultural experts at sites, saying attacking libraries and archives wasn't just incidental, it was called an attack on cultural heritage.
Part of an effort, it claims, where Israel is trying to erase the connection of the people with their land. That's the framing.
But not just physical sites. The source also talks about intangible culture.
Exactly. Traditional songs, stories, even keffiyeh patterns becoming symbols of quiet defiance, but often stifled. It mentions UNESCO also documented losses like craft guilds, pottery traditions, smashed artist unions, shattered clay pots.
Just heartbreaking detail.
Yeah. And says the Arabic language suffered, lullabies whispered behind closed doors under new schooling regimes described in the text. And this erasure, it claims, even went digital.
Digital, how so?
Claims of algorithms scrubbing Palestine from maps, generative AI tools creating landscapes where Palestinian villages, never existed.
Wow. Erasing it from the virtual world, too.
The source does mention some scattered efforts remaining. People trying to reclaim memory, scholars, artists assembling archives. It specifically cites a 2024 compilation called Yesterday, Come Closer,
which aimed to consolidate Palestinian collective memory.
Right. But the document's final thought on this is incredibly somber. It suggests for every page saved, thousands of songs, recipes, stories just slipped away. And by 2030, it claims, a full cultural revival exists only in the hearts of those who remember how it felt to belong to this land. It presents it as a cultural catastrophe.
So as we get towards the end of our deep dive here, the source pulls together these powerful voices, echoes it calls them, that cried out before the final silence.
Yeah, it lists striking quotes from figures some we've mentioned: Mandela, Angela Davis, Edward Said's quote, "We have been dispossessed. Our society has been destroyed. It's very difficult to forget that."
And Darwish again.
And Darwish again, yeah. "We have on this land all that makes life worth living." It also includes a more recent voice, Judith Butler, quoted from 2024. "What's happening in Gaza is genocide. under our collective watch.
The document's point about these specific voices
Is that their words echo louder in retrospect than they ever did in the moment. Looking back from 2030, it argues, the gravity is just clearer.
And to really drive home its perspective, the source offers these half-real, half-prophetic testimonies from figures it imagines or knows reflecting in 2030.
Right. A refugee poet saying, even our memories feel like ghosts. A student in London feeling only the empty sky answers me. A Maori activist. Palestine was the barometer we all checked. Without it, we have no scale for justice.
These voices form a chorus of grief, according to the source.
Yeah, a final reminder in the document that once the story is truly gone from living memory, the world inevitably will forget the lessons it taught.
Which really brings us to the source's final reflections and the core message it seems determined to leave you, the listener, with.
Yeah, the profound message, as you called it earlier.
Right. Wrapping up our dive into the land that remembered when no one else did. The document argues Palestine was much more than just territory. It claims it was a kind of beacon of conscience, a shared mirror of our humanity.
The source suggests remembering Palestine, standing with its people, meant remembering all who suffered injustice, recognizing the universal stakes. And so the claimed erosion of its memory means a great truth is lost, something that wounds the global conscience itself.
And it leaves us with that powerful, maybe unsettling thought for you to consider, straight from its conclusion. If a people can vanish with impunity, what hope is there for the rest of us?
It ends by saying, when the story, the memory, the lessons, when they're truly gone, the world might look back at that empty threshold from the beginning and just see nothing.
And in that moment, it claims, we'll understand what was sacrificed. According to the source, it wasn't just a history lost.
But fundamentally, the part of ourselves that knows the difference between memory and oblivion.